Hi, welcome to the New Voting Project. My name is Kunal, your host, and today we have a very special guest joining us on the show, Amber McReynolds, a leading expert in election administration and voting policy. You are an appointed member of the United States Postal Service. Yes, that's right, folks. Your mail is partially delivered because of this person right here. And you serve on the Compensation and Governance Committee and also Strategy and Innovation Committee, which I'm sure those will be things we touch upon today in our discussion. You're also a founding chief executive, now in an advisory position at the National Vote at Home Institute, which is a nonpartisan organization that works to improve vote by mail systems. Formerly, I guess you're located out of the city of Denver. You were the director of elections in the city and county of Denver, Colorado. You led the implementation of ballot tracking and enhancing communication surrounding voting. I mean, the list just goes on of things you've accomplished. You're also a co-author of When Women Vote and serve on the National Task Force on Election Crises and the National Council of Election Integrity, as well as the MIT Election and Data Science Lab. By the way, MIT, please accept my college application. Lastly, you're also a graduate of UIUC and London School of Economics and Political Science. Again, I do not do you any justice in that introduction, but thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I understand you're very busy.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and I always love doing podcasts, especially that are the audience is younger people coming out of college in high school, because I truly believe that the improvements to our voting system, not only today but in the future, are really going to be led by the next generation, and I want to do whatever I can to impart what I've learned and also help support the next generation of leaders, because this is a multi-generational situation. We've got to keep improving our civics and our civic health over time.
Exactly. And by next generation of leaders, she's specifically referring to me. No, humble humility.
Yeah.
But in any case, let's get into these questions. Just to begin, start off talking about your background. Why you chose to enter the voting rights space, the political space. Now you're an appointed member of USPS. You're a governor there. I mean, it's just governor is just a great title. So what drew you to this voting rights atmosphere?
Yeah, in my undergrad, well, really my whole life, I've been interested in government politics. My mom was a school teacher. I grew up in a household. My dad was a criminal defense lawyer and public defender for a while, and then he became a judge more than 30 years ago now. And so, just social justice, government, politics, all of that has just been of interest to me for my whole life. My grandmothers both worked as election judges, and I have a great aunt who actually was in high school with Ronald Reagan, in a tiny high school in Illinois. And so also the women in my family, my grandmothers and my great aunt, paid very close attention to politics, and they, come from a generation where many women in their generation and also their mothers couldn't vote. And so I learned a ton from those women. I watched their example, and really, I think I'm where I am today because of a lot of guidance and a lot of listening to them growing up, because they were were very involved, very engaged, and felt it was critical for everyone to participate in the election, regardless of who you vote for. If participation is high, our democracy will be stronger. So I did my undergrad political science, speech communications at University of Illinois, and then I went and did my graduate work at London School of Economics. During that time, I worked in Parliament for Tony Blair's Solicitor General,
Wow.
and was a research aide there. So it was lovely to be involved in the UK
Yeah,
politics system and the
that's just a
parliamentary
different
system.
world.
Yeah,
Imagine.
yeah. But it was the perfect opportunity to study comparative politics during graduate school and be in the UK, in a very, center of the universe, if you will, with regards to European politics and 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 um, and all of it around the UK. And at the time, we also 9/11 had just happened. I was on one of the first flights leaving the country to move to England when they were reopened after that. So the time I did my master's was an interesting time to be studying comparative politics, given the dynamics in the world at that point in time. And then I moved back to the US and worked actually for running a council that was focused on improvements in the criminal justice system, but realized very quickly that while it was in my realm of wanting to improve systems, the topic of the issues around it were not as inspiring to me as the voting process. And so I actually applied for a job with the New Voters Project. Interestingly, similar to the title of your podcast, but it was a nonprofit, nonpartisan, focused on increasing civic engagement on colleges and universities and creating civics programs with them during the 2004 presidential cycle. And I worked in Iowa, was one of the state coordinators, and that really, for me, that was the catalyst of how, frankly, difficult, confusing, and bureaucratic
I could
and
imagine back in
all of that.
2004,
Yes,
how that must have
during the presidential, yeah,
yeah.
and so everything, that was really before we had online voter registration and before there were other advancements in technology, and so it just really exposed for me how much opportunity there was to innovate in the voting space. And so literally during that, I was traveling to Denver for trainings. The first time I stepped foot in Denver, I was like, wow, I love this city. And I started looking for jobs and actually applied for an operational manager role at the Denver Elections Division. And then I, kept advancing and became deputy and then became director in 2011 and an expert and really catalyzed change and redid that organization, made it one of the best offices in the country.
Yeah.
We innovated on policies and technology and all of it. And so that really is where, that's kind of the journey. And then obviously today left that to help everyone else around the country. And then magically and interestingly, which I never expected, if someone would ask me 5 years ago, are you going to be on the Postal Board of Governors? I would have said, what are you talking about? But the good thing is I'm the only woman. I'm the only independent elector. And I'm the only person with elections experience. And as we all see, elections and the Postal Service have a lot of synergy in terms of operations. And there's a significant value in my elections background that I think I bring to the Board of Governors. So
Yeah.
that's the journey.
Yeah, that's a pretty tremendous journey, I'll tell you that. It was long ago before I was even born. I mean,
Yeah.
you were like doing things that today we're dealing with, and
Yes.
you could effectively call it a crisis we're in currently. And I would just like to add, the Colorado Secretary of State is probably one of the best Secretary of States in the country at this current moment, and I'm sure that's no doubt partly due to the presence you have in the electoral administration in Colorado. So thank you, and I commend you for the tremendous amount of work you've done. And I would just like to talk about your role at the National Vote at Home Institute. Kind of touch on what the organization does, the core values, the objectives you're trying to accomplish. And then of course I'll talk about youth and how we should be the center of everything because it's true.
Yeah. So I was the founding CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute. It's an organization focused on improving and expanding access to vote by mail systems, and that includes policy work, but that also includes the implementation side with helping election officials get that design right in terms of the system. So I joined. I was really a founding board member back in 2018, and then we were looking for someone to lead the organization, and the other board members kept kind of saying, "Why don't you come and lead the organization?" And I, at the time, was still the director in Denver, and was really thinking. Actually, I was thinking about running for Secretary of State at the time. Decided to pass on that because I frankly thought that I could have a bigger impact nationally. So I had left my director role in Denver, came over to run the National Vote at Home Institute. It was really just me and one other person plus the board at the time, and we built out the organization, brought in more funding, and then honestly, it's interesting how timing works because who would have thought that I was building an organization for a year and a half or so ahead of what would become a crisis in 2020 with regards to the pandemic. And we were set up amazingly enough and prepared to support the nation from a vote by mail perspective. And we had to, I hired, we expanded almost 500% in terms of the staff just in
Oh,
a few months in 2020 because there was such a great need. So many states needed our help, and we ended up helping about 42 states, whether the jurisdiction or the state in it. And the most number of people ever voted by mail. We were the ones kind of driving and putting out a lot of the strategies around how you could improve and expand it in a pandemic. And so it became a critical piece of the 2020 election cycle, and really part of the crisis management that was the pandemic. So we kind of went from a small thing to a very big thing. And then now in 2021, we were working on policy work again. We've just the board hired a new executive director who's coming on board or just came on board this past week. And so now they're kind of contracting back, so it was big or small, big, and then it's now kind of back to being smaller and focused on those policy implementations. But I hope it continues to thrive and continue doing all this work going forward. And I continue to be an advisor and want to help the org, just like I want to help a lot of orgs as they work on these important issues.
yeah. No, well, at least I know you're not a procrastinator because you were planning. You had a crystal ball and you knew there'd be a pandemic, and this was perfectly delivered, and almost like a savior to the voting system. I mean, everybody voted by mail, and that was part
Oh,
of a controversy caused by a national administration. It was also partly why we had such an increased turnout. We had 150 or 160 million people voting in an election. That's almost half the electorate in the United States. I mean, so it was crazy ridiculous. And that's something we'll touch upon later. Is that, and you said it at the beginning of the interview, which is that if more people vote, doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, you're still stimulating healthy democracy. So I find it incredibly weird and just terribly just, oh my god, that the one side of the aisle is refusing to accept that norm and actually counteracting and suppressing the act of voting. But we'll talk about that later. After we talk about a healthy democracy.
yeah, I think look, my approach my whole life, and again, I have not been affiliated with either political party. I truly believe if we put voters first in the way that we design our policies and our processes and our technology, we will improve that voting experience. I proved it in Denver. We combined improvements in the policy realm, process improvements plus technology. That's how you improve the voting experience. I don't care how you vote. I don't care who you choose. I don't care what issues you vote on. It doesn't matter as long as you have an excellent and superb and magnificent voting experience. And that's what everyone should expect and have.
Right.
But I do think that what right now, we're at a point in time where, and this is not new, politicians, frankly, on both sides of the aisle, have tried to tip the scale one way or another, whether it's gerrymandering, which we've seen examples of it on both sides of the aisle, or it's leaving independent voters out of the primaries, and both sides tend to agree on not wanting to have fully open primaries or utilizing ranked choice voting or doing some of these other
Right.
innovative things. Or back in the day, even when the voter registration deadline was created, it was created to benefit the two political parties so they could have their walk lists and go door to door and have it for 30 days before the polling places would open to talk to all their voters. So that registration deadline is literally made up for the political parties. And so I think we have to get out of the space of let's put the voters first and stop with the what do the campaigns want and what does the candidate want and none of that matters. It should be about the voter. They should be center first and the priority in the process. And I think as a nation really need to get to that point, and that's certainly how I've tried to lead in my life, and I hope that that continues to be the path that we go on to improve this process.
Right. And I think that's an excellent process of just living. Putting people first doesn't sound too difficult. But I just want to circle back to 2020, right?
Mhm.
Crazy year, hectic. We had a once in a century pandemic, top to bottom national election. I mean, I was personally working on many local campaigns. Figured national politics was a little too much this time. Um, and so I just wanna ask, what you know places did you see and markers did you see for improvement? What solutions would you advocate for coming out of 2020, being in this historic situation, and how are you advocating for those things at a policy level at USPS?
Sure. Well, I think for 2020, and I this was also came out of 2016.
Right.
The way that we elect presidential candidates is flawed, significantly flawed. So, thankfully, the DNC decided to basically not allow anyone other than Iowa to use a caucus. So they moved most of the traditional caucus states to doing an actual primary. So, like, I helped in actually helped as a consultant with Alaska, Wyoming, Kansas. Instead of doing caucuses, they did ranked choice voting plus mail ballots to every one of their eligible voters. And that's how they run their presidential primary. It was historic turnout. Uh, the great thing about ranked choice voting, and this is why I think it's so important for a presidential race, is when you have 20 candidates in the first few states, someone can win with 10%
Right.
of the vote because you've got so many candidates. Plus, so then you have 90% of people voting against the one candidate, basically, but they win. Plus, you get in a presidential primary, people are dropping out weekly. When there's that many candidates, people are going to be dropping out. So early voting and vote by mail become difficult because people are voting and they've potentially chosen someone that dropped out the next day. So ranked choice voting addresses that because you can rank your candidates. So if someone drops out, that's fine. You go to your next choice and you tally from there. So I truly think starting with that, I think that the presidential structure for selecting the candidates needs to be changed. It needs to be, I think, more regionalized. So it's not this sporadic weekly crazy thing all over the country. I think it needs ranked choice voting. I think it needs to get rid of the caucus system because it doesn't serve military people, anyone who's working, single parents, parents with small kids at home. I could go on and on. People who work shifts, whatever it might be, people get left out of the caucus process, just like
Right.
they do election day when you make it one time. So I think starting there, and then I think certainly when people have more options, whether it's a ballot coming to them at home, like in California and Colorado
Or
and
same day
Utah,
registration.
or same day registration or early voting over a long period of time at vote centers, get rid of the traditional polling places, do vote centers so people don't show up at the wrong place. You can go to any of them. All of those advancements are critically important to giving and empowering voters with choice.
Mhm.
And this old way of you've got to show up to the government assigned polling place on election day and you've got to get your name on the list 30 days prior or whatever. We don't need any of that anymore. It makes no sense and it's not customer focused.
Right.
So I think all of these reforms, they're not partisan. Like Utah is all vote by mail, just like Colorado and California are, and Oregon and Washington. Virginia expanded vote by mail, and they selected a Republican for governor last month. So, or this month. So this is not a partisan issue. It is simply about improving the system, and we really need to take, I think, the partisan politics out. And I do think the final thing I'd say is transparency of the election process. I believe is critically important. Most of the American public doesn't understand how elections work, so I think we need to do more to educate folks, possibly create even. And I've been articulating this for a while. I think we need to start civics in first grade. This
Mm,
civics in high school is too late. It needs to be
yeah,
first
I
grade.
think that's
Uh,
music to my ears. You know what I say on this show?
yeah.
Civics is like the ABCDs. You
Yes.
have to start early for them to start spelling sentences. I mean, they have to know how to vote. Like if you ask the average high schooler, right, is voting important? They're going to say yes. Of course it is. All my teachers tell me to vote and this and that. But if you ask them, how do you vote? They'll be blindsided. They'll be like, I don't know. They'll Google it, right, and then they'll learn. And I've encountered that personally where I live. So trust me, I completely concur with the idea of starting early.
Yeah, and I have an 8 and 10-year-old,
Okay,
and my ballot comes every election, local, state, whatever it is. And one of the kids will get it out of the mailbox, and they're like, "Mommy, when are we going to start working on your ballot?" Because we've done this since they were in first grade,
right.
since they were reading. They literally read the ballot with me. It's a long ballot. They'll say, "Mommy, what does mayor do? What does governor do? What does state rep do?" I explain all this to them. It takes me 3 or 4 days to fill out my ballot with these guys. Um, but it is a civics lesson, and they have been voting with me since first grade. I just think
Yeah,
we've got to engage at a younger age
yeah.
on civics, and then I think all high school kids should be required to
Poll
serve
worker?
as a poll worker.
Yeah, I've been a poll worker.
Oh, that's awesome! I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So, and one thing that I'm just starting to recognize is that we'd have voters walk in, right? I was a poll worker in 2020 primaries, pre-pandemic. We'd had voters walk in, we'd have to send them out because they came to the wrong precinct location. And I'm just starting to realize that's a terrible inconvenience because we'd basically be saying, go down the street, go another 1 mile for you to
Yeah.
vote. And that doesn't make any sense. And
No.
it's something I reiterate on the show all the time is that convenience and simplicity gives people, autonomy and agency, right? If you give a
Right.
voter everything they need, voting to the access, voter registration, accessibility to ballot locations, ballot tracking measures for security, then they'll be more inclined to vote. But if you hinder them with restrictions, then of course they'll be less likely to vote, and that's something I see all the time. So yeah, no, I definitely agree with the policy objectives here. And I just want to ask, what we talked about ranked choice voting. Is there an ideal redesign of the voting system in the U.S. that you're looking to advocate for?
Sorry that you cut out. So the voting system in the U.S. I heard that part, but I didn't hear the
Okay.
first.
I
Sorry.
said, the ideal redesign of
Oh,
of the
sure.
US voting system. Any other solutions you think should be advocated for at the national level?
Yeah, so I think those primary, ideas that we had, I think are certainly important. I also think that independent redistricting commissions are really important. California has one. Colorado, we just did our first one, and I was actually a commissioner on the independent redistricting commission that just completed. So I do think that we need to address those issues because that's really how we should not be in a place where politicians are picking their voters. It should be the voters are picking politicians on elections and ballots, not the other way around. So I think we have to address those core issues.
Mhm.
I think that for primaries, all primaries, 45% of the country are now independent and rising. Millennials and Gen X, Gen Z, that all of that voter registration that's happened in the generations upcoming, most of them are choosing to be independent. Over 60%, I think, is the average in most states for it. 18 to 24-year-olds picking their registration as unaffiliated.
Mhm.
So this is a huge trend that's been happening over the last 10 years. And these outdated primary systems that leave people out and don't allow you to participate if you happen to be independent, I think are problematic, especially for younger generations, because we're all choosing to be independent. We're choosing, to not need a party label next to our name to make a choice. So I think we need to redo primaries with regards to that. I'm a big fan of ranked choice voting in use in certain types of elections where it makes sense. Alaska is going to try out a system this year where they have a fully open primary. They're
Mhm.
advancing the top 4 people to the general, and then they'll use ranked choice voting on the general election ballot to determine the winner. So I think that's an interesting, new model to watch, and it could be instructive for the rest of the country. I think certainly more choice. So vote by mail. I'm a huge fan of what Colorado,
Right.
California, Utah, what we've all done. I think also early voting, if people want to vote in person or need to vote in person or need to register, having a good window to do that at vote centers all the way extended through election day. In my mind, we have two types of voting. We have in-person voting and we have voting at home.
Mhm.
And in-person voting should not be this confusing construct of early voting at vote centers and election day at polling places and all this. It should all be one. So I really do think that that's important. And then I think on registration, we have lots of government systems that capture your name, your address, your date of birth, your driver's license, and social security. And so automating all of that is really, really important, not just for making sure that people aren't left out of the process, but also for making sure addresses are up to date, that that information stays current, because that's an election security issue, but it's also an efficiency issue. If you move, you might fill out a change of address at the postal service, you might tell the DMV, however you communicate that, we should be able to consume that automatically and move you so you don't have to fill out another piece of government paper. So I think all of those things combined, obviously with additional technology enhancements, investments, transparency, all those types of things I think will be better for our future here in the United States with regards to elections.
Right. And what about the idea of a national holiday on an election day? It sounds like a really good idea.
Yeah, so it sounds like a really good idea is probably the best case it has in terms of being successful. So here's the issue I have with national holiday.
Okay.
So first off, national holiday is only going to happen in a general election, which is once every 2 years. There's lots of primaries, local elections,
Right,
school
right,
board,
yeah,
all
exactly.
this stuff. So we're going to only give it to people in already the highest turnout elections, and we're not going to do anything for those smaller local elections. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two, who gets the day off on a national holiday? Well, government, bankers, and some businesses, but mostly people in the working class, restaurants, airports, gas stations, hotels, recreation, everything's still open. Target's still open. Most of these places are still open with the exception of Christmas and Thanksgiving.
Right.
So I think when we look at this, who is that benefit? Well, it just gives an extra day off to the people that already can take time off to vote or already do take time off to vote. And then the other thing that happens is that local governments run elections. So if we have a national holiday, they're going to have to pay everyone time and a half who touches or deals with the election process, which is public safety, technology departments in every county and city, hotline numbers to call into, the election offices themselves, the poll workers. The burden of the cost is going to fall on local entities that can't afford it. And then the other thing, what else happens on holidays? Well, transportation options go down because those are all mostly government employees that get the day off. So now we're going to have less transportation options. We're
Right.
going to have libraries and rec centers in the places that are normally polling places closed that are going to have to be reopened. Someone's going to have to pay to staff them. All of this creates, frankly, a nightmare from a logistics and cost perspective. And it doesn't actually help the people that are currently left out that are working multiple jobs that will be working on the holiday. And it takes kids out of school. So now parents either
Right.
need to take the children to wait in line for 3 or 4 hours
Gotta deal with the kids.
or find someone to do that. So I think it's a poorly thought out shiny object is a good way to to say it.
It's a question I get all the time. Why don't we have? And I say, in theory, it sounds great, right? Who doesn't love a day off? I'd love to come home from school and just chill. But
Sure.
I don't know. I don't know if, like you're saying, it would have the success. It would have the input and the output. I don't know if they'd match. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's far better to expand the period of time that people have and they can make those choices. The national holiday has so many downstream impacts that people just aren't really thinking through. And I don't think it actually helps the people that they think it'll help. And that's the problem. I mean, the people that are not voting because they've missed a deadline, they
Right.
couldn't get off work on a day, they worked multiple jobs, all of that. And a national holiday doesn't really address that for them because those people are often working multiple jobs and can't afford to take, time off. And if they had an extra day off, they'd go work at the other job.
Yeah.
right? So it's just not helping the people that it claims to help.
Yeah. Well, there is something that recently is going to help millions of Americans, which is infrastructure bill. The infrastructure
Right.
bill was recently passed, I think, a week ago. Great news to hear out of federal legislation and just federal politics. I don't know if you follow. Well, I'm sure you follow, but I don't,
You do?
from a very local and almost separated perspective, it seems like there's some crazy polarization these days. But on that note, should we not follow that path and pass voting rights legislation that's currently being proposed, the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and upgrade the ways of voting? I mean, obviously, you've highlighted some very critical issues in the voting process. Why haven't we passed these amendments or these pieces of legislation that aid and can assist in the process?
Yeah, sure. So for sure, I think that there should be better federal standards and more clear federal standards around elections and voting. And both of the two the bills do exactly that. They're setting baselines. They're not setting ceilings. They're setting baselines. And part of the reason that this is so critical as well, and what I'll also say, kind of leading up to what I'm going to say on the particular bills, is that we have a history of federal legislation around elections and voting, and it has happened repeatedly. We can go back to the 19th Amendment or the 15th Amendment. But both of those clearly were amendments passed, ratified. And then the Voting Rights Act itself was a bipartisan bill. It was bipartisan. So was the National Voter Registration Act in the 90s that set up Motor Voter. That was all bipartisan. Then we have the Help America Vote Act that was passed after Florida 2000, also all bipartisan, signed by President Bush. Then we have the ADA, which there are elements of the Help America Vote Act that include ADA provisions. Then we have UACAVA, both UACAVA bills, UACAVA and UMUVA, that deals with uniformed and overseas voters and their options to vote, all bipartisan, all examples of federal legislation around voting. So anyone who tries to say this is a state's issue and the federal government has no role is just wrong. Like, there is historical precedence for it, and we have done it in a bipartisan way repeatedly. And then the second piece is, because we don't have some of these national baselines. We've got a mix of deadlines around the country. It's confusing for everyone
Yeah.
that votes, everyone that administers the election, everyone that reports on the election, and every entity that supports it, including the United States Postal Service. Last year, the Postal Service sent out a letter to every single state expressing concern about some of their deadlines around absentee ballots, the deadline to request it or the deadline to return it. And they said, look, these don't even fall into our normal processing periods of time. So if you're in Ohio, a ballot, you could sign up to get a mail ballot on Friday. If a election official mails that to the voter and they have to have it back by Monday, there's no way that that's even physically possible for anyone to do. And so the Postal Service rightfully was saying, hey, states, legislatures, you've got some issues here with just the mechanics and the operations. This doesn't work. And this is why a federal baseline, that's just one example, but this is why a federal baseline would help solve some of those discrepancies, differences, and frankly, help everyone in the election process have more clarity around what the requirements are. And then I think it also helps improve security of our elections. Right now, disinformation flies, and misinformation, malinformation, however you want to, inaccurate information, however you want to say it, it's easy to fly around the United States because nothing is the same state by state. So a voter hears something about another state and they think, oh, is that the provision in my state? And so it's easy to confuse people. And so that in and of itself is an election security, a national security issue. And bad actors are exploiting that right now, every single day.
Yeah. Well, on to more light and refreshing topics, I guess. Well, I mean, there's nothing more. Of course, I talk to my federal legislators, right? My federally elected officials. They're in support of it. These bills, but it's impossible for us to pass anything. I mean, infrastructure by itself, it took so long to hash out and really divulge what both parties wanted, and until that fades away, I can't see much progress on most fronts, on most politically incentivizing issues. But voting rights, I feel, should be at the forefront of that because, like you said, it's just a baseline. It's a federally regulated standard, and we have plenty of those. Like you said, we have a history coming off of voting rights in the '60s. We've been dealing with this issue. You could say post Reconstruction or pre Reconstruction. Civil War time period. I mean, this is an issue that surrounds and almost encapsulates the United States as a whole. I find it hard to believe that this is just a coincidence. It seems very you know, interesting. That's
Mhm.
where I'll leave it. But I would just like to ask in closing about your advice to my generation, Gen Z. Again, I don't know where they got Gen or Z from, especially Z. Why couldn't we have been Gen A? I mean, there's a whole rant I could go on for that.
Yeah. And why didn't you get to pick?
Exactly. I didn't have a
Who
choice.
picked it?
I didn't vote. I didn't vote on this.
It seems like it would have been far better for Gen Z to be able to vote on picking the name.
Exactly, and I'm sure they're gonna make that for every generation, past us, so that's great. But
Yeah.
how do we, make an impact on voting elections, policy, I guess making sure our mail gets through, but there's also a certain, proportion of the population that feels exhausted, feels alienated, doesn't have time, maybe they're working, multiple jobs, multiple streams of income are coming in, or they're ignorant. They just simply don't vote because of the dire polarization we see in our federal offices. So, what is your advice to basically everybody? So, it's a very open ended question, and that's on purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I think first, and this is something certainly that I model with my children, and this is our little family motto. So I'm going to share this. But I think it's actually very pertinent for the time right now. Our motto as a family is have courage and be kind. And I've, over my career, when I think about it, those two things are constant. It doesn't really matter what you're doing, what you're working on, what you're focused on. Those two things, just having the courage to improve and be better, and be better the next day, and commit to making our world a better place. That's all part of being courageous, and then being kind to each other. So, I think, yes, people are going to disagree on policy. People are going to disagree on the path to achieve a certain thing. But the thing about it is it's always better to have alternate viewpoints to build something new or build something that's going to solve problems. And the best things are built with collaboration and different ideas and diversity of ideas and diversity of thought. And so I don't think we should sort of, I feel like right now there's this tribalism. Everyone's listening to only what they believe, or they're only choosing, like we're literally choosing, if it's Fox or Onan or whatever, you're choosing a network you agree with. The other side, are choosing the networks they agree with to listen to. And so, like for me, I know I listen to all kinds of things, mainly because I want to hear what everyone is saying about the same thing, but also because I know I've got people in my circles that don't agree with me, and I actually want to learn more about why what they think and what they're gonna do. So I think we have to be, honestly, better listeners in a nice and empathetic way. I'm not suggesting that we engage with people that have demonstrated a complete detest for American values and our Constitution and our ability to vote. I think there's a category of people that that have clearly decided that they don't care about democracy and they don't believe in democracy. That's a problem. But I think there's this other group of people that are confused by the disinformation, confused by the talking heads they hear every day. And I think if we can kind of bring people, and at least in a new generation, people that haven't voted yet, just to talk to each other and not kind of put up the wall, and and almost simplify how we're having the conversations. I know with my 8 and 10-year-old, sometimes when I just talk to them about various issues of the day, whether it's world hunger or homelessness or healthcare issues, like listening to my children articulate their thoughts around that is one of the most unifying and pure things I've ever heard, because they don't have a lot of judgments built up in their head around these issues yet. They're just simply articulating very clear solutions and why it matters and all of that. And I feel like we almost need to get back to the simple, almost childlike approach to some of these issues, because we need to a certain extent, set some of the judgment aside so that we can have a meaningful conversation again, because Washington, D.C. is broken. Like, it's great that the infrastructure bill passed, but there's a whole slew of bills that have been sitting there for months with no action, including the Postal Reform Act that has bipartisan sponsors. Like, it has bipartisan sponsors. It will help the Postal Service,
Right.
significantly into the future. And it's been sitting there just in the backlog. Right. So we've got to get back to functioning and listening and I think approaching each day with kindness, with courage, and really, trying to solve our greatest challenges. And I think the next generation is going to be far better at that than the current generation that has all the power. There's one generation that has all the power right now. One.
Right.
They're all in the same generation. like, and my generation there's very few people that are elected officials now, and we're probably mostly going to get skipped because the current generation has held power for far longer than they should have. You shouldn't serve 30 or 40 or even 50 years in Congress, really? I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah.
So I think the next generation can think and approach and converse on all these issues in a far different way than the current generation with power.
Yeah. No, and that generation is mine, Gen Z. Again, I don't know where they got Z from. I really like to stress that. But no, I completely agree. I mean, there's just a slew of things that we need to fix. And I don't see that happening in a pragmatic way in any sense right now. And we'll have discourse at this level. This is why I feel the podcast is extremely important, because it's just a discussion. This is not calculus. This is a conversation that anybody is capable of having. And understanding, and possibly objecting to, or even agreeing with, right? It offers that capability, and that medium. So I feel like I'm in a great space, but that doesn't mean the problems are getting solved. So it's up to great, leaders like yourself to ensure that the next generation has the power to follow through. Run for office.
Yeah.
Carry that voting power with them, and pass it on to their generations, much like you're doing with your kids. That's the habitual cycle we have to start. And so on that note, is there any last words you'd like to pass? Words of wisdom, advice.
Yeah, I would just say, vote locally, think globally. So that's a little saying I always do. I mean, a lot of people, I feel like, think their vote doesn't matter. And their vote matters in a lot of ways more at the local level than it does even at the national level. And so every election matters. Like, gotta engage and gotta vote in every single election and get educated. Serve as a poll worker for sure. I'm a huge advocate of that. Won't take too much time. It's a great way to learn the process. And then the election administration, field is incredibly diverse from a skill set perspective. So there's technologists, there's GIS people, there's customer service agents, there's translators, there's project managers, executives, operational people, logistics people, communication people, which is huge now. So there are all kinds of different fields that you can kind of come from to then work in elections. The election administration field is fascinating. I would encourage anyone that is kind of figuring out what direction they're going to go from a career or college perspective, or trades perspective, to really look at this field. And by being an election judge or going and working in an office or even touring an office, you can see some of that. And we need awesome people to come into that field. And I can't say enough about my experience being an election official and now working on voting rights and voting access the way that I have. So I think it's one of the best fields to go into, and I would encourage all of your listeners to seriously look at it and consider it. Tell all your friends to vote. Have the conversation. A lot of my friends will be like, Amber, all you do is talk about voting. Yeah, and I ask my Lyft drivers. I ask people
Yeah.
I engage with. I do. I mean, I think we have to live it. And I often, when I go to a new city, I'll ask the Lyft driver, "Oh, did you vote?" And I kind of figure out a way. And I find it fascinating how people talk about this. So I would encourage all of you to live it every day and figure out how to, bring it in to those conversations,
Yeah.
because you might come across someone who has not voted, and they might tell you why, and they might vote again, right? So um, I think that one. And then I think, look, disruption is, and I have disrupted a lot of things in my career, but you don't have to tear it down to change it or disrupt it. And I think there's a big difference. Like, disruption can be healthy, change can be great, all of that, but there's also a point where the whole thing, the whole house doesn't need to get torn down either. And right now we're seeing some of this from January 6th and some of the aftermath and what have you of an extreme level of disruption where it was a tear it all down mentality. And so I think we have to kind of um, be very thoughtful about change and what that looks like and why, and is there a need to do it? And you don't just change for change's sake. You change to improve something, you change to make it better. And again, I think we need to put voters first. Put voters first, and that crosses all political, spectrums, all different dimensions: campaign finance, gerrymandering, and independent redistricting, voting access, voting rights. All of it needs to have a focus on putting voters first and putting the customer first and meeting people where they are in their everyday lives. And when we do that, I think we can certainly transcend a lot of this craziness that has occurred around the election process.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And you're not the only person to ask everybody, have they voted? I do that everywhere I go.
Good.
Their do you vote?
I love it.
Especially, and I'll encounter people who live in the districts and I'm working campaigns and then they haven't voted. And I'm like, I'm a little biased, but I will make sure that they vote. A period. And on that note, is there a platform? This is the only part of the show where you get to promote yourself. So if you want to advertise your social media so people can
Sure.
follow you, I'll be sure to link everything in the description as well.
Sure. Yeah. So Twitter is at Amber McReynolds. And then the book. So I did write a book last year. We're probably going to do a new version soon because there's some things that changed. But When Women Vote, we have a website. We also have social media for that: Instagram and Twitter. So it's at When Women Vote, and there's a little underscore, I think, on the Twitter one. And then I'm on Instagram. I'm also on Facebook. I'm going to be launching a website with all my projects and a lot of my work on it soon. So it's probably going to be ambermcreynolds.com or amber.something, but that website will come soon. I'll link it on my social media, but that will be a collection of kind of all the different initiatives and projects I'm working on, and also my space to create and my space to invite people in to help me create and think about these things going forward. So I've got a lot of things in the works that I'm really excited about. And I'm also probably going to be looking for people to help me with that very soon. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you for doing this podcast and having the space and conversation for people to come on and giving your listeners, ideas for how we get better in the future.
Of course, no, and thank you so much for your insight. Wish you the best of luck with all your future projects. You're working on a lot of great stuff. So anytime you want to come back on the show, touch upon them, get some awareness out, feel free. The door is always open. Um,
Great.
and I do appreciate your time, of course. And anytime my package ain't here, you're gonna be getting an email from me.
Oh, that's
uh,
funny. A lot of people are doing that to me, by the way, since I got appointed. They're like, "Oh, can you if I have an issue," I'm like, "Well, I'll refer it to the appropriate team."
no,
Oh,
no,
yeah.
I'll leave you be. But no, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Take care. Have a good week.